At the Battle of Changping in 260 BC, entire hillsides were transformed into fields of death, and when the fighting ended, more than 400,000 men lay dead or condemned to die, their bodies scattered across valleys so vast that no army, no city, and no ruler possessed the ability to remove them. And this is where modern audiences usually stop, overwhelmed by the scale of killing. Yet the far more disturbing question is what happened next, because in the ancient and medieval world, death did not end when the fighting stopped. It began a second phase, one governed not by honor or strategy, but by neglect, profit, fear, and logistical collapse. And the bodies left behind were not simply remains, they were problems that demanded decisions. Pre-modern warfare produced death on a scale far beyond the systems designed to manage it, and once armies withdrew, the dead remained embedded in the landscape, contaminating water, attracting animals, spreading disease, and haunting roads and villages for generations, while no permanent institutions existed to take responsibility, meaning the fate of the bodies depended almost entirely on whether anyone stood to gain by intervening. In theory, ancient societies believed the dead deserved burial, but in practice, burial was selective and almost always reserved for one's own side, a reality visible across Greek warfare, where truces were sometimes arranged to recover fallen citizens not out of mercy, but because leaving bodies unburied was believed to anger the gods and threaten the living, while enemy dead were ignored or hastily covered where they fell, their disposal treated as a nuisance rather than an obligation. Roman warfare intensified this divide because Roman soldiers feared dying without burial rites, believing the unburied soul could not rest. Yet Rome's greatest defeats exposed how fragile that belief was, and after catastrophes like Cannae in 216 BC, where tens of thousands were killed in a single day, survivors prioritized movement, security, and salvage over burial, leaving fields stripped of armor and valuables and choked with decomposing bodies, while the army marched on. The same pattern reappeared after Carrhae in 53 BC, where Roman legions were annihilated far from friendly territory, their bodies left scattered beyond recovery, and decades later, Roman writers still described the shame of knowing those men lay unburied in foreign soil, erased not only from life but from ritual. Sometimes the dead were not buried at all, but absorbed directly into the environment, as after the Teutoburg forest disaster, where Roman legions vanished into woodland and marsh, and when Roman forces finally returned years later, they found bones bleaching in clearings, skulls fixed to trees, and fragments of weapons embedded in the ground, preserved not by ceremony but by abandonment. Across ancient frontiers, this became common, as bodies surfaced along roads, rivers, and passes long after wars ended, not because people were unaware of them, but because responsibility dissolved once armies moved on, a reality later formalized in Byzantine military thinking, where commanders were advised to recover their own dead swiftly while deliberately leaving enemy bodies exposed to demoralize survivors, turning decay itself into a weapon. When no one intervened, nature did, and ancient and medieval writers repeatedly describe wolves, dogs, pigs, birds, and insects stripping flesh from bone, while skeletons remained exposed for years, transforming former battlefields into places avoided rather than remembered. Yet most battlefields were not abandoned indefinitely, because victorious armies had powerful incentives to return, and the first phase of cleanup was almost never burial but looting, as soldiers and camp followers surged back onto the field to strip the dead of weapons, armor, belts, boots, jewelry, and anything made of metal or leather, a practice universally accepted as a reward of victory. And archaeology confirms this pattern across civilizations, because intact weapons are rare, precisely because nearly everything reusable was removed within days, leaving behind only shattered shields, splintered spears, and bodies no longer worth searching. What happened next depended on urgency, as some corpses were dumped into shallow pits, others left to nearby populations, and others ignored entirely when armies needed to move quickly, favoring speed and pursuit over sanitation, a logic that persisted into the medieval world, where Christian belief emphasized burial but lacked the systems to enforce it after mass slaughter. Enormous engagements, such as the Battle of Salsu in 612 AD, where hundreds of thousands died during retreat, overwhelmed any attempt at burial, leaving rivers choked with bodies and landscapes fouled for years, not because burial was forbidden, but because scale defeated intention, while similar scenes followed wars across early Islamic expansions, Carolingian campaigns, and steppe conflicts, where mobility mattered more than cleanup, and armies rarely lingered long enough to address the dead. Even later, medieval battles followed the same brutal logic, as territory, ransom, and momentum took precedence over burial. And after Agincourt in 1415, victors buried their own, while enemy bodies were placed in mass graves or shallow pits, with skeletal remains still reported decades later, illustrating how quickly order collapsed once armies departed. Sometimes burial came late, as at Visby in 1361, where defenders were buried days or weeks after fighting ended, still wearing armor because decomposition had progressed too far to make stripping worthwhile, turning haste into preservation, while even victorious soldiers were rarely honored individually, as common men were covered in anonymous trenches without markers, their names erased. Religious institutions occasionally intervened where armies would not, with monasteries organizing burials when decay threatened surrounding communities. Yet even these efforts were incomplete, and travelers centuries later continued to report bones surfacing from fields long after the wars themselves had faded from living memory, revealing that pre-modern battlefields were not truly cleaned but slowly forgotten, and that the question of who dealt with the bodies after ancient and medieval battles rarely has a single answer, because it was usually a shifting combination of victorious soldiers driven by profit, local populations driven by fear of disease, religious figures driven by obligation, and long stretches of abandonment where no one acted at all, showing that in the pre-modern world, death did not end with the final blow, but entered a second, quieter phase governed not by honor or victory, but by necessity, neglect, and forgetting.